best. Don't watch the clock. I've got to watch the clock. All right, we've got a lot to jump into this morning. Is my slide up? We can put the slides up. That'd be awesome. All right, we're jumping into the second sermon of 3 discussing what is worship. So if you guys remember last week, we talked about worship. We talked about worship as living sacrifice. So when you get a worship pastor talking about worship, I just can go for a long time. So you guys can set your clocks for, 2-3 hours. We'll be here. We can just hang out, have a good time. I hope you packed a lunch. No, there's a lot we're going to jump into today in discussing worship is giving your heart. I just want to clearly define for you right now what your heart is. Your heart is your affections and your allegiances. Right now, tell your neighbor affections. Now tell your other neighbor allegiances. So we give our heart, our affections, and our allegiances to whatever we give it to is ultimately what we're worshiping. So we're on a journey together today to discover that, to peer into our own hearts, hopefully, and God will speak to us about what we're worshiping. He really wants to give you a new heart today. Some of you are like, well, I already prayed that prayer, Pastor Bryan. I already got a new heart. He wants to do it again. Okay, so just want you to hold that in your mind. Last week we discussed worship is living sacrifice. This idea that every day we wake up, we're making choices to say no to some things and yes to other things. Those are value judgments. And in that judgment of value, we're placing worth in particular places. If you begin to scratch the surface of that, you begin to dig down into what you actually worship, which comes from the word worthship. And so I just want to encourage you guys remember, how many of you remember my assistant, the yellow balloon? The yellow balloon. Somebody last week after church decided to do some business with their yellow balloon. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you need to go back and refer to last week's sermon. They did some business around their yellow balloon, and that yellow balloon was like Isaac in that Genesis 22 passage. Remember, it was that thing that was cherished and valued to Abraham, and God said, I want you to sacrifice your own son. Well, this person did some work with their yellow balloon, which happened to be around finances. They're in this impossible uphill situation with their finances. How many of you have been in that place? I know I have a lot of times. They said, okay, God, I'm giving this to you. And just like God did with Abraham in Genesis 22, where Abraham's wandering around, meandering around these mountains for 3 days for the place where God will show him to worship, to make this offering, this sacrifice. And at the same time, God is causing this ram to be climbing up the other side of the mountain until they meet in this harmonious place where God says, no, hold back your son. And he substituted him with this ram. God provides, it says. In our place of sacrifice, God is the provider. We discussed that last week. Well, this person, they laid down their yellow balloon, and they begin to do some work on it. And lo and behold, out of nowhere, they received an answer to prayer in the form of $9,000. Can we bless the Lord for that? Come on. That's the kind of God that we worship. That's who Jesus is. That's what he does for us when we enter into the conversation of worship. And we say, God, you are really above everything else. And help me to live like it. Help me to see it. So today, we're going to be jumping in, discussing the heart. Worship. What is worship? Worship is giving your heart. So I want to pose a question for all of y'all. I'm from Texas, so I can say that. I actually was born there, only lived there like 2 years, but that's a long story we're not going to get into. My question for all of y'all is, are you a thinking thing, a thinking being, or are you a desiring thing? René Descartes, the famous French philosopher during the Enlightenment, he's a mathematician, scientist. He said, I think, therefore I am. A highly lovable and enlightened bear known as Winnie the Pooh philosophized, sometimes the smallest things take up the most room in your heart. Who's more profound? The Bible says in Proverbs 4:23, above all, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Now, we can start pitting the mind against the heart or desire, and I don't want to do that today. We are holistic beings, but I want you to hear this quote. Martin Luther, the great reformer, said, whatever your heart clings to and confides in, that is really. Whatever your heart clings to and confides in, that is really your God. Notice this idea, clings to. Attach that word to affection. Clings to, affection. Notice that word confides in. Attach that idea to allegiance. Your heart is your affections. Your allegiance is what you cling to, what you confide in. Martin Luther said that really is your God. We aren't thinking things first. We're desiring things. You see in John 1:38, Jesus doesn't ask the disciples who first come and follow him, what do you think? He doesn't ask them, what do you believe? What does he ask them? What do you want? Whew. That's a lot scarier question, if you're willing to engage it, than what do you think or what do you believe? What do you want? The issue from the beginning of Genesis is the issue of the human heart. Who can know it, it says? Who can wrangle it? Who can shape it? Who can form it? Who can direct its pathways? There's this pursuit of the human heart throughout the entire story of the Bible. The Bible is a story from beginning to the end, and in it, God is saying, I love you. You are my people, but your heart is far from me. And so he's pursuing us in every means possible, and he gives this beautiful promise to us in Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36. He says, behold, the days are coming when I'm going to give you a soft heart, a heart that's responsive to me, a heart that loves me, a heart that doesn't run away from me or harden itself to me, a heart that's not afraid of my love. God had said, I'm going to give you a new heart. He called this was actually in the language, covenantal language, which means it's an unbreakable promise. It's this place where love and law meet together and impact us and change us. And so from that promise on, people were waiting. Humanity's waiting. God, will you come through? And will you give me a new heart? Help me. It's the cry of David in Psalm 50 and 51, a broken and contrite spirit you will not deny. God, I need a new heart because my heart keeps leading me astray. Right now, you are more a product of what you love than what you think. Think about it. This explains the discrepancies between what we think we should do and what we actually go and do. But it gets even more complicated because as people, we just complicate things. There's even a gap between what we want and what we think we want. I think I want this, and then you pursue this. And you're like, but I said I wanted this. I mean, it's really easy to see this in our spouse, right? It's really easy to see this in our kids. When we live close to people, they're like, I really want this, and then they go, opposite direction. You're like, what? What is going on? I'm confused. We are more a product of what we love than what we think. Just ponder this for a second. No one thinks their way into new tastes. Sit down with a 5-year-old. They're eating Pastor David's favorite cream of corn. And they hate cream of corn, okay? 5-year-old hates cream of corn. And you tell them, hey, Mikey, just think that you like cream of corn. And then he takes a bite and he smiles, ching, and you say, Mikey likes it. No, he's going to look at you like, are you an idiot? What is the deal? Just pretend like it's ice cream. What? Cream of corn, ice cream? That sounds disgusting. We don't think our way into new tastes. We desire our way there. There's this amazing story. It's not in my notes, but I'm doing pretty good on time. So you can look this up on YouTube. Look up the opposite bicycle. And there's a guy who was working with some engineers. He's an engineer. He's working with some welders. And the welders thought it would be really funny to switch the steering mechanism on a bike. So when you go right, it really turns the bike left. And when you go left, it really turns the bike right. And he thought, you know what? I'm just going to hop on this bad boy and whoo, take off. Well, he hops on it and he crashes. Then he gets on it and he's really thinking hard. He's channeling his inner bicyclist. I can do this. He crashes. It takes him 8 months. It takes him 8 months to ride the bike. He's riding it 5 minutes every day. That's what he did. I'm going to get on this bike 5 minutes every day. His son, who was like 7 or 8, it took him 2 weeks of every day. When this guy hops back onto a normal bicycle, guess what happens? He crashes. The point I'm making here is you don't think your way into new behaviors, into new tastes, into new loves. You don't think your way there. It's just like riding an opposite bicycle. You desire your way there. How did he get so he could ride that bike? He wanted to prove to those welders that he could do it. It was a desire. It was a challenge. It was something he pressed into, and he had to do it over and over again. And this speaks to us about our heart and speaks to us about worship. The heart is the place of our desiring, our allegiances, our affections. These things impact our brain and our thinking, not the other way around. Our mind is part of the process, though. I don't want to dismiss that. But our heart directs our worship. Our desires direct our worship. Will you turn into Luke 7 with me? Today I'm going to talk about a couple of tables. And you'll notice there's some tables set up here. We're having communion again today. I'll explain that later. But desiring happens around a table. Today happens to be my middle daughter's birthday. Courage. And I'm super excited because I am actually preaching from one of her life verses today. It just happened to line up that way. And one of the things I appreciate about my daughter is her name. One of the meanings of her name, Courage, is to tell one story with their whole heart. She doesn't know how to do it a different way. She just came out of the box like that. Whatever it is, it's 100%. And I want you to think about that as you're reading in Luke 7 with me today. We're going to jump into Luke 7, 36 through 40 initially. This is going to speak to us about the table, a table and an alabaster jar. And we're going to pull out some things that speak to us about worship and about giving our heart. So, let's jump in. Luke 7:36, one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and reclined at table. This is speaking of Jesus. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment. And standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. And Jesus answering said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. Simon's a little braver than I am because his response was, say it, teacher. All right, you invited me. One thing I want to point out here is, you can write this down if you're taking notes, worship takes place around the table. Notice from this passage, there's this picture of worship with the lady and the alabaster jar, and there's actually a picture of worship with the Pharisee. We see here as well. But worship takes place around the table. It's at the table we find whom we give our affections and allegiances to. Paul says in the New Testament, some have as their God their stomach. Interesting. Just drive down Eagle Road and look at all the food places there are. Worship. Worship. Some have as their God, their stomach. I'm not going to jump into that whole lot, but what we have around our table, the kind of food that's there, the kind of people that are there. One question I'd ask you in discovering what your heart is who sits around your table? Who do you invite around your table? Are they all people who are exactly like you? People who think like you do, who speak like you do, who do all the things that you do? Or is there this experience around your table of invitation and bringing more in? You see, who we have around our table and what we have at our table speaks to our affections and our allegiances. Some things I want you to notice in this passage and who's around the table. There's a woman, she comes, and I want to point out a number of unusual details for the first century where Jesus was at. You notice it says, standing behind him weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wipe them with the hair of her head. She kissed his feet and anointed them with ointment. Everything this woman is doing right now is crossing the boundaries of social mores that they have in the time. Women touching a man. There's this idea when people would come together, they would kiss each other. It wasn't erotic in any way. It was simply a form of greeting, but that typically happened between family members or happened with same sex. So men would greet men with a kiss. Women would greet women with a kiss. And here we have this woman entering in and she's kissing Jesus at the table of Simon. Simon, who would have been well-versed in all of the social mores of the day. There's this structure of righteousness before God built on the word as a foundation, but then they added all these layers of rules and laws and experiences on top of that. And this woman comes in and just topples all of those things in this moment. She's wetting his feet with tears and kissing his feet. Now we're like, oh, okay, that's not too bad. I'll just unstrap my shoes and take them off. That's not how it was. They're walking around in dirt and dust in sandals or barefoot. Jesus' feet are probably dirty. And she comes in and she's weeping. She's washing his feet. She undoes her hair, which is a sign of an uncouth woman, a woman who is full of shame. The hair was the woman's glory, and upstanding women at the time had their hair done up a particular way, and women who weren't wore their hair differently. There was a distinction there. And so she lets it down. She takes her glory and washes his feet. The second point I want to make here is worship draws out the most vulnerable, intimate, and costly of actions. We talked about last week costly actions. We see a costly action here in the ointment itself. You see, in the least, this alabaster jar would have been 1 year's wages of the average worker. In the least. She cracks this baby open and starts flooding, pouring out on his feet. Normally, you wouldn't pour on their feet, you would pour on the head. Symbolic again of Jesus' worth in comparison to us. She says, oh, you are worthy of everything I had. This was this lady's most prized possession. Church, just for a minute, say, I'm going to save my entire year's wages and come to church one day with a huge roll of dollar bills. I don't even know how big that would be. It'd be awesome. Depends on how much you make, right? And you just set that baby in the offering box back there, and you're like just crying, weeping. That's the picture we have here. She's weeping. She's loving Jesus. It draws out the most vulnerable, intimate of actions. Her affections are seen here. What does the woman give? Where are her affections? She gives her dowry, the alabaster jar. She gives her glory. Her hair is let down, and she's wiping his dirty feet with them. Her tears she gives. Her reputation. She was crossing boundaries just to touch him. And it just draws out for me the question, when's the last time I hungered beyond words? I thirsted. I wept for the presence of Jesus. When's the last time, church, you've been in that place? Where all your affections in that moment were unraveled and gathered back up by Jesus, and he was the only thing. We're so practiced in being full, giving our affections away to other things. When we come to church, it's just like, there's not much there for Jesus. This woman calls us into worship. I want to speak to you about her allegiances just for a second. You see, she endures, next we'll see, she endures criticism from the Pharisee. He says, man, if this Jesus guy was really a prophet, he would know who is touching him. He wouldn't even have anything to do with this lady. So obviously Jesus' aunt is defunct because he's letting this woman come into this scenario around the table. She is tainting the worship here. Think of the judgment coming out of Simon. Think of just, can you feel it in the room? It's changing the atmosphere. She doesn't even just endure criticism from the Pharisee. In other passages, parallel passages, we see the disciples say, Jesus, why would you let her do this? We could have taken that ointment and we could have sold it for money and helped the poor. How dare you let her do this? Think of the judgment that's present in this moment of worship. And if you're a young adult, I want to speak directly to you. You're a teenager. I know God is speaking to you when you come for worship. I know God is here in prayer, but I just sense sometimes we're held back a little bit because we're afraid of the criticisms that might come. This woman says, no, there's another way. When our worship is consumed with Jesus and what he has done for us, and our love is saturating the space, there's nobody else in the room except him. There's nobody else in the room except him. So you don't need to worry about the judging eyes or the criticisms or the critiques, because you're worshiping Jesus. And while anyone who would bring those critiques or criticisms, they're worshiping someone else. When's the last time you bowed? When's the last time you wept before Jesus? These are questions the text calls us to ask. When's the last time you gave your heart to him in singing, in dancing, in shouting? Church, I could pull verse after verse after verse that has these as expressions of our heart in worship for Jesus, for the Lord. And he calls us to do that even with people around us. Let's move on. Chapter 7, 41 through 48. I want you to notice worship draws out actions that ultimately express our heart, express our desire. 7:41 says, let's go back real quick just for context. Jesus answering and says, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he answered him saying, say it, teacher. Now just think for a second, okay, how would you answer this? You might say something like, dude, you're totally missing the point. Hey, let's go here. Listen how Jesus answers Simon. A certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii, which is a ton of money. We'll just put it there. And the other owed 50, which is a lot less money. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which one of them will love him more? Simon answered, the one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. And he said to him, you have judged rightly. Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house, you gave me no water for my feet. You see, it was custom for a servant to wash their feet as they enter into the house. He says, you gave me no water, Simon, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. She's washed my feet with what was most precious to her. You gave me no kiss, Simon, although that was the custom, the cultural custom. But from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet, which was not the custom of the day. You did not anoint my head with oil, again, the cultural mores, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much, but he who is forgiven little loves little. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. Notice this. Simon's in this place of judgment. He's critiquing. But notice what he isn't doing. He's not fulfilling all of the social mores that he's holding other people up to. Meanwhile, she's not fulfilling them either, but her heart is expressing allegiance and affection to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Who is Simon expressing his allegiance to? Something to ponder. Notice how Jesus speaks to the situation. I love this about Jesus. He didn't say, hey, Simon, you're a loser. What's the deal? He uses a story. He starts to tell, he answers with a story. That seems like something you might do with a 5-year-old. But there's so much wisdom packed into this. He uses a story. Why does he do this? Stories grip our heart. What story is gripping your heart? What narrative right now in your life is gripping your heart? Is it a narrative of scarcity, or is it a narrative of abundance? Is it a narrative of, God, you've held out on me, you've ripped me off? Or is it a narrative of, God, you have been so good to me? What story is gripping your heart? And in this story, Jesus is saying to the Pharisee, though you may be a Pharisee, you might have everything all together, in your heart you love God less than this sinful woman. Notice how sinful woman was repeated multiple times. You love God less than this sinful woman. You've got your life together, everything looks good, but you love so little. You see, true worship cuts to the heart of unbelief in both the religious and the irreligious. And today you might be here, or you might be tuning in, and you might be saying, I'm not a Christian, so what are you even talking about? I'm not a worshiper. I just want you to, for a moment, jump into what science is showing us, which is really fascinating and amazing. The slide you'll see here, there's a picture of some brains. The bottom is one person's brain with exposure to different interactions, and the top is another person's brain. And the news article here from Digital Trends was Apple as in Macintosh, Apple causes religious reaction in the brains of fans, say neuroscientists. Now, all of you PC users are like, I knew there was something wrong with those guys. Gosh, it's confirmed. So there's this story, there's this article, and more science and more research is going on where they're saying there's something different about people who worship. There's something different about Christians, and they explore the anatomy of the brain. How does worship affect the brain? And we ascribe this idea of worship, it's just a church context. It's got these particular images and ideas going on with it. Well, here this article and the research that's coming out says, really no, anything can be a source of worship, and anything can affect your anatomy and your physiology, anything that you give yourself to. So I just want to grab a highlight out of this. It says, Riley contacted the editor of World of Apple, Alex Brooks, an Apple worshiper who claims to think about Apple 24 hours a day, which is possibly 23 hours too many for most regular people. A team of neuroscientists studied Brooks' brain while undergoing an MRI scan to see how it reacted to images of Apple products, and heaven forbid, non-Apple products. Right, Pastor David? According to the neuroscientists, the scan revealed that there were marked differences in Brooks' reactions to the different products. Previously, the scientists had studied the brains of those, The scan revealed that there were marked differences in Brooks' reactions to the different products. Previously, the scientists had studied the brains of those religious faith, those of religious faith, and they found that, as Riley puts it, the Apple products, now listen, the Apple products are triggering the same bits of Brooks' brain as the religious imagery triggers in a person of faith. What you worship changes you. Where you give your affections and allegiances changes you, changes your physiology. Think of if you have as your God your stomach, it changes you physically. It changes your brain. Look, what's going on with technology right now is rewiring our brains. What we give ourselves to changes us. So I want to just speak to everyone here who's saying, I'm not sure if a Christian. You may not be a Christian. You may not be worshiping Jesus. You are worshiping something. And today, if there's one thing you leave with, what I want you to leave with is asking that question, what am I giving my affections and my allegiances to? And is that thing ultimate? Is that thing ultimate? Is it really worth it? Is it really worth giving my heart to? You see, everyone has a vision of the good life. Everyone has a vision of the good life, a thing that gets your heart pumping, a thing that wakes you up in the morning. Everyone has a vision of a good life. And some of you are like, nah, I don't really have that. I don't really want to wake up in the morning. I just kind of like to sleep in. Your God is comfort. Everyone has something they're giving their heart to. You will ultimately love something. Is the something you love ultimate? That's the question we're asking today. Worship is simply giving your heart, your affections, your allegiances, giving your affections and allegiance to what is ultimate, though. That's the question. What is ultimate? Some of you are asking, well, what about those who are religious? Look at Simon the Pharisee. They're not off the hook. Simon the Pharisee. For religious people, we believe, if you're religious, you believe your ideas and doctrines about God are ultimate, not God himself. Simon's sitting there with God. He's sitting there with Jesus. And he's judging him. He's not even fulfilling the social mores himself. And that's what we do when we're religious. It says he says to himself. Jesus perceives that. I want you to notice this. You can write this down. Religious people hide from their heart. So we use all this structure, we show up, we do all these things, and really in all of it, we're just hiding from what our heart really is. Irreligious people give their heart away to things that destroy them. But in the end, we have shriveled hearts, religious or irreligious. But Jesus, he renews and refreshes your heart with his heart. That's a beautiful thing. We pursue all of these other things with our heart, and Jesus is saying, just come to me and I will refresh you. I will give you what you're thirsting for. A place we see this in the tabernacle or the temple, which we discussed last week. We talked about the brazen altar, this place of sacrifice. One of the things we see in the tabernacle, which is really this dwelling place of God on the earth, it's a place where people had access to God's presence. And there were these different articles, these different pieces of furniture that they would symbolically and by faith engage God with sacrifices. And there's this table called the table of presence or table of showbread. Now, I want you to imagine last week we talked about the brazen altar. There's animals all around. There's sheep and cattle. There's manure. There's blood. There's sweat. There's all this hubbub of activity in the outer court where these sacrifices are going on for the brazen altar. But when we come to the table, it's a completely different experience. You see, you pass through this thing called the brazen laver. It's a place where you washed yourself up after all of that sacrificing. And you stepped into this tent, and it had these thick layers of curtains. And there were these golden walls, cedar panels covered in gold. And in there, the only light would have been this lampstand that was continually burning. And there was this table. You see a picture of it here, this idea. There's this table there. It's made out of pure gold. Everything in there's gold, symbolic of purity, symbolic of deity. And on this table there are these 12 loaves of bread, symbolic of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, symbolic of God's people. And it's like his face is shining, radiating, shining down on his people. And at this table, you'll notice there's this rim around it, almost looks like a crown, symbolizing lordship and deity. And the priests would enter into this place, and they would worship God with this bread, eating it. And they would have these flagons of wine that they would pour out as drink offerings and drink wine. And I don't know if you're like me, but when I add bread plus candlelight, it equals date night. This is a date with God. You're in there. It's pointing to the beauty of communion. The table's where worship happens. This table became much more prominent in the diaspora. You see that after Jesus ascended, shortly after that, the temple was destroyed, never to be rebuilt again. And Jesus tells us that we are the temples. You and I, we are this place where this worship is now arising. We are the place where there's access to God's presence because his Spirit is filling us. Which brings me to another table, which is the table of our heart. There's a table of our heart. So what if I just want you to imagine, church, you have a table that your heart has been invited to and you have invited guests to. And I'm going to have my assistants bring a table up for demonstration this morning. We are the temple. You're the living temple of worship, and you have access to God's presence. So I want you to, for a moment, imagine that your heart was sitting at a table. Who would be dining with you? Who would you be worshiping? Who would you be worshiping with? So let's start at an easy one. The God of consumerism. We just need some more clothes, need some more money. I watched this video. Who knows the KonMari technique of organizing? Raise your hand. That Japanese lady, she's amazing, right? I think she's a robot, but don't tell her I said that. This lady on there nails it on the head. Her house is filled with clothes, just piles and piles of clothes. The basement filled with clothes. Her whole spare room filled with clothes. All these clothes. And she's, whenever I'm mad at my husband, I go to the mall, and I just feel so much better. Just think of the God of consumerism, the sense that we need more money so we can get more stuff. Materialism is driving us. Think of it, how every single year we're coming out with a new phone so we can get a new phone, and really they're not updating any features. They're just changing the covering on it. And there's this sense that if I could just get that new thing, my life wouldn't be obsolete anymore. So if the God of consumerism we're inviting to our table, I shop, therefore I am. You know what? For some of us, going to the mall is a spiritual high. And there's all these symbols of worship around us as we walk through. And we usually don't do it by ourselves unless you're a closet shopper. Is there a such thing as that? You bring other people with you. It's a communal experience. You're inviting others into this experience with you. And when you put those new clothes on, you just feel new. The rejection, inadequacy, pain of your life for that moment kind of melts away, doesn't it? How about the God of entertainment? I have a bone to pick with the God of entertainment. Let's start with March Madness, anyone? How many hours of giving our heart? How many hours of sitting? Usually it's accompanying food too, right? How many hours are we sitting watching other people play sports? You know, people who are way into the God of entertainment, you know way more information, way more statistics about your own kids or your own wife. It's like you're studying a woman and knowing her ways. You know the ways of basketball, and you're entertained, and you can avoid the pain that's in your life for a moment. We've got football. I had to ask somebody, how are you doing? Well, I'll be better in the fall. What does that mean? You know, football. Football's going to start. We're giving our heart to sports, to entertainment. And these gods, they keep us spellbound, and they keep us binging. Just need more sports. I got to get more. I've got to watch more. So there's ESPN 1 and now ESPN 2, and I don't know how many different ESPNs there are, but somebody in here I'm sure knows. Why do we need all of them? How about this? This is a fun one. You know, it used to be, I've got to watch for one more minute. You know, got to watch my show. Let's just put it on for one more minute. Now we're like, nah, let's just do one more episode. One more episode. Actually, it's far gone. It's past that. It's like, you know, it pops up and you see there's a whole nother season. You're like, oh, I got to get through this season. Whew, what time is it? I'm going to stay up and I'm just going to get through this season. It will be worth it. And we binge and we binge and we binge on entertainment. And it's just like the next Marvel movie coming out. Sorry, I'm picking on somebody in particular. The next Marvel, it's just the same thing over and over and over again, but we keep going back to that table. We keep going there. Now, hear me out. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with watching something. I'm just saying, who are you entertaining at the table of your heart, and for how many hours, and what are you sacrificing? What are you missing out on to give yourself to those gods, the gods of entertainment? Here's one. The phone. Screen time. How many of y'all know how much screen time went up the last year? An hour and 28 minutes on average. For the average American per day, it went up an hour and 28 minutes. Folks, we're up to 11 hours of screen time a day on average. I don't even know how to comprehend that. We'll factor in the fact a lot of us are knowledge workers, so we're working on the computer part of the day, but it doesn't factor in all the time on social media, watching Netflix, all kinds of things. And I just think it's like we hop on to social media and we look at it, we're like, oh, they look happy. I wish I could be happy. Maybe I'll just look at happy people for longer and I'll be happy. And we scroll and we scroll. Whose life are we not living? Whose kids are we not investing in? Whose spouse are we avoiding? This is forming us. Rather, the word is deforming us. Our desires, when they lead us to the table of worshiping false gods, it deforms us. I'm going to pick on one last one. What about kids? Kiddos. We just want to give our kids a better life than we had. And so it's like we say, yes, oh, yeah, we'll let them do that Broadway play. Yes, it's 63 nights in a row, and we have to say no to the rest of our whole life, but we're going to do it. Or sports, we combine this love of our kids, like, oh, we just want them to succeed. And if they'll succeed, I'll feel successful. And so we're at the sports events night after night after night after night. But then we're telling our kids, go to church. Jesus loves you. He wants you. Invest there. And yet we're with them, investing our time cycle after cycle, season after season, giving ourselves to sports. Some of us, we're disconnected from our spouse, and so we confide in our kids. We feel like our spouse doesn't understand us, and so, but our kids do, and the other way around. And there's all these ways that kids and our family are invited to the table, which they should be there. Don't hear me wrong. But they should be in the right seat. Jesus gets the seat of honor, not our kids, not our spouse. Maybe these things aren't speaking to you. I want to give you a couple questions. You can write these down. Where is your heart? If these aren't speaking to you, I'm asking you today, where is your heart? What is at the table of your heart? Where do you give your first fruits? That's kind of churchy speak for, where do you give your best? Where do you give your best hours of time? Church? Where do we give our first money? Where do we give our best ideas? Where do we give our most passionate love? Second question, where's your functional heaven? Where's your paradise on earth? The front of the magazines? Oh, if I could just get there. That place, it's so green. It's amazing. They're going to have good food. And you get there, and you look at the grass, and you look at the picture, and you're like, this grass is not green. What is the deal? They photoshopped it, okay? Just so you know, they photoshopped it. And then there's that annoying person from Australia with the loud kids. Sorry, Australian people, I don't know where that came from, but those kids are loud, and you're like, this was supposed to be a vacation. This was my paradise. And all these people around you that are destroying it. What if it's just like, my place of peace is just a moment of silence where everything is under control. Well, somebody will bring me food, tell me when to wake up. You're imagining yourself in prison. That's what that is, where you have no responsibility and nobody's bothering your time or bothering you, invading your space. We call that prison. Where do you go for consolation or celebration? Where do you go for consolation? Who are you confiding in when you need consoling? Are they leading you to Jesus, or are they leading you somewhere else? When you're celebrating, where do you go? Who do you invite into that place? Who do you dance with? We get something from these guests at our table. They cover our shame. They cover our inadequacy. They cover our failures. They cover the place where we deeply long to succeed. The places where there's no hope. They distract us from our despair. Church, I think Jesus is looking at our table tenderly, and he's saying, I would satisfy you. You see, you've given your heart away. We give our hearts away like those Russian stacking dolls. We give a little bit here, and we take another layoff, and we give it here, and we give another little bit here, and we take it here until we come to Sabbath, and it's just like this little tiny one left, and we say, here's all my heart, Jesus. Here's my heart, Lord, shriveled and cold. This, when we started with so much. I just wonder, what would Jesus do if he walked around our table, because he is? What would he say? Church, I just want you to think for a second. What would he say? What would he do with this table? Can you imagine him just seeing and knowing what he's given and the table he would invite you to? Can you imagine how it's just breaking his heart and wrecking him? And he's seeing that you thought you invited deity to the table, but really you invited demons to dine with you, and they're robbing from you, they're stealing from you, they're taking life from you. When we're pursuing with our hearts, I just want life. And Jesus is walking around the table, and I think somewhere something in him rises up like a lion, and he just says, enough! Take it away. Take it all away. He walks around in the rubble of our life. Knowing the desire of our heart. Knowing the true desire of our heart. Is communion. John 2, he speaks to us. another table. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there, making a whip of cords. He drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who sold pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." He calls us out of selling ourselves for less than what we're created for. He's inviting us to the table of communion. He's promised to give us a new heart. But how do you know you can trust this Jesus? The Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. How do you know you can trust Jesus and give your heart to him? Jesus doesn't just turn over the tables of our life. Jesus turned over his life for us. He turned over his life. He was beaten. He was afflicted. He was marred. He was broken. He bore the weight of all the sin of the world, and he rose back to life again so you could be forgiven much, so you could love much. You see, he wants the table of your heart. He wants it clean. He wants to cherish your heart. He wants you to cherish your own heart. He values your heart so much so it drove him to flip tables over. Can you imagine him seeing his mom taken advantage of by the money changers and how he would respond? Can you think for a moment of the mother's heart or the father's heart who sees their child wandering astray, being robbed? When they think they're getting life, they're being stolen from. Can you imagine that place in their heart and Jesus burning with love saying, "Father, I will go. I won't just turn over the tables, but I'll turn over my life." So this brings us to communion. Instead of giving our heart to consumerism, entertainment, things that deform us, Jesus wants to heal and renew your heart and form it for love. I'm going to end with this quote and call us to worship. James K. Smith said, "Christian worship is the feast where we acquire new hungers for God, for what God desires, and are then sent into his creation to act accordingly." The table has been set. The table is set today. Today, worship and taking communion, coming to the table, giving our heart means giving permission to Jesus to flip over the tables of your life. Trusting because he gave his life up for you. He's going to renew you and refresh you. And what he's inviting you to is so much better than all the things we've been trying to cover up with. Jesus broke the bread and gave it to his disciples and said, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took the cup and gave thanks and offered it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant." The covenant spoke about in Jeremiah 31 and 36, the covenant where he invites you to the table to get a new heart, to have new desires to love what truly is ultimate, to love what is lovely, to love what will give you life and not rob from you. Church worship is giving your heart, giving away your affections and your allegiances. And Jesus is the only one worthy of that because he gave all for us. So as we're going to play a song, I just want to ask you to stand.